Welcome to this latest episode of Two Heads Are Better Than One with me, Rod Grant.
And me, Cameron Wyllie.
And Cameron, we are this week going to be talking about our personal educational priorities, our personal manifestos.
Our personal manifestos for Holyrood, where we will sweep to power and organise Scottish schools for the next 5 years.
Gosh, that would be fun, wouldn't it?
Well, I don't know if it'd be that much fun.
Oh, no, I think it was a lot of fun.
Fun, yes. Yeah, well, it'd be interesting until we were assassinated. But basically what we're going to do today is Rod and I are going to talk about what we think should be happening with regard to education in the upcoming election and what political parties should be saying. And the next time round, we'll hear from political parties, we'll talk about their actual manifestos, and hopefully speak to some politicians about, and you may want to consider, if you're a teacher or a parent or a pupil, because 16 and 17-year-olds have the vote, which parties to vote for on the basis of education. So what we decided was that Rod and I would secretly write down what, 5 things we thought were the most important things in that, in our personal manifesto. Rod, what's your top thing?
I've got one word that I really love when it comes to education, that's autonomy. So I think in Scottish education, there's simply not enough autonomy. There are too many chiefs looking after what should be a relatively straightforward discipline, and politicians and chiefs of education, local authorities, and all kinds of people, Education Scotland, whatever they do, are overly involved in the running of our schools. And I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Somewhere on my list, I would definitely have the complete abolition of Education Scotland. Education Scotland, nobody seems to know what it's for. I wrote a piece 2 or 3 years ago on my blog, House and Joppa, about this very fact. And I asked lots and lots of people who worked in state education advisors, all the way down, in inverted commas, to probationer teachers about Education Scotland. And they all said the same thing. We don't really understand what Education Scotland does. It hasn't done anything useful for us recently. We don't know how many people work for it. Well, we don't know how much it costs.
Yeah. That was going to be my first question, actually. Do you know how many people work for Education Scotland?
Yeah, I think about 300 people work for Education Scotland. At least that was the story a few years ago. They may have made some people redundant. Most of them, interestingly, a lot of them are seconded to Education Scotland, of course, to become the deputy advisor on well-being in the west of Scotland, rather than being the deputy head of a difficult school somewhere. Which of these things sounds more appealing? Well, personally, for me, I'd rather be the deputy head of a difficult school. But I can see that if you're, struggling a wee bit with your work-life balance, then seconding yourself off to Education Scotland on a preserved salary, of course, a conserved salary, it might be appealing.
Wouldn't it be great if someone from Education Scotland got in touch with us? You think we've got an Education Scotland listener?
I know we have an Education Scotland listener, but there's the one possibly. But it would be good if somebody from Education Scotland would come on and talk to us about what Education Scotland does, because that would be really, really interesting. And I've got no doubt that teachers everywhere would tune in order to find out what it is that they do.
Yes. But this, of course, is the salient point. We have a group of individuals who are dictating in some way educational policy within our schools, but with, for me, a complete lack of accountability.
Oh, and the same with local education authorities, really, as well. So one of the things, of course, that we would like to see them dictating about is to do with behaviour and discipline in the classroom. And that would be my number one thing. My number one thing would be calm classrooms, returning to a situation where teachers can teach and pupils can actually learn.
Well, it goes hand in hand, doesn't it? Because with that autonomy and with handing over the power to leaders within schools, they would have the ability then to look at that inclusion at all cost policy.
And you'd get rid of these kind of phenomena where head teachers are loath to even temporarily exclude pupils because they don't want to be a statistic to the local education authority who will phone up and complain about them suspending pupils. In fact, if a pupil, for example, assaults a member of staff or assaults another pupil, they must be suspended from school, in my view. And if they suspended a member of staff, I wouldn't be like them return to that same school. And that would just be that would just be a rule. It would be a rule that said that if you assault a member of staff, regardless of not quite completely regardless of the circumstances, because I can envisage circumstances in which assaulting a member of staff might be permissible if, for example, they were attacking you at the time. Yep. But generally speaking, the kind of assaults which staff are facing at the moment, even being spat at, up to, in my mind, even being sworn at, really, all of that should result in children being suspended from school. And if it's a serious matter, they should be suspended permanently. They should be excluded. And we'll discuss at some other time what you would then do with them in terms of education.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I mean, of course, when I worked in a local authority school in the 90s, that's exactly what did happen. I had one particularly difficult pupil was swapped for a particularly different pupil from a school down the road.
I think you should do that with head teachers as well, actually. Just swap head teachers as a difficult.
Head teachers.
Yeah. So that also relates to the presumption of mainstreaming, which we talked about at least 2 episodes ago, and people just seem to agree very, very strongly that the presumption of mainstreaming needs to be radically changed. I would call the new policy the presumption of unmainstreaming, that you would presume that certain children required to be educated separately, either in hubs in mainstream schools or just in entirely separate premises by people who are expert in looking after kids who are, say, high up on the ASN spectrum, or who have real strong behavioural difficulties. Nobody is condemning these children. We're just saying they're not being educated properly by being mainstreamed. And I think that 95% of the teaching profession would agree with that.
Yeah. And of course, it's debilitating for those children in the classroom who are wanting to learn and who are not wanting to misbehave. And the inclusion that, apart from learning needs, my big one is really on behaviour, because there is clearly a violence epidemic in our schools. And I'm not using that to be dramatic. I think it's absolutely true. We're hearing too many stories and speaking to too many teachers for it to be anything other than an epidemic.
Yeah, I think that the truth of the matter is that probably in most Scottish schools, most of the time, classrooms are being run properly. There are 2 problems, however. One is that in the classes, there are young people who require an undue amount of time.
Yeah.
So you can have a perfectly well-regulated classroom, but still have problems with the presumption of mainstreaming, because child A requires half the teacher's time, which means that the other 32 children in the class, I was talking to a primary school teacher the other day who's got a class of 33, with 2 really difficult additional support needs children, delightful kids, but nonetheless, they take up an enormous proportion of her time. Now, that is problematic because it's just not fair to the other children in the class. Now, if these children are 16 and also predisposed to having temper tantrums, which they throw furniture about or swear at the teacher or attack the teacher, that is on a different scale completely. But it's still a problem of the presumption of mainstreaming. So you need to have a situation in which common sense prevails, and where the object of that common sense prevalence should be to ensure that teachers can teach in calm and orderly classrooms.
Yeah.
Also without children running around the school screaming as well. That should just, I don't understand that. I don't understand that phenomenon of corridor wandering and running around corridors and things. I can't see why that can't be stopped without spending another single penny on anything.
Well, it should be.
Yeah, just...
And that's about autonomy.
Yeah, completely.
That's completely... I'm going to throw a spanner into the works here, because I was thinking about mainstreaming the other day, and I have a primary colleague, a bit like you, works in the local authority, whose main problem actually is that of his class of 32, there are 4 children, perfectly well behaved, perfectly academically able, who have English as a second language. Now, the difficulty there is, well, you don't need me as an expert to be telling you as an expert what the problem there is. There are communication difficulties.
And do they have a learning assistant to help them?
No.
Well,
this is actually a point on my manifesto, is that resourcing needs to be looked at very seriously. Where's the money going?
Yes, I mean, I think particularly in cases where of English as a second language, where the pace of the child's learning is clearly affected by their initial, at least, inability to speak English competently, then that's crying out for learning assistance. Crying out for learning assistance. I'm not actually sure that learning assistance work in situations where children are apt to be violent, for example. I don't see how that works, but I can see exactly how it works if a child needs help doing English as a second language.
And where does the money come from? Well, we'd get rid of Education Scotland, wouldn't we?
Yes, that's 38 million, I think.
Yeah.
That rings a bell.
Would we get rid of local authority education departments?
Yeah, I would get rid of local authority education departments as well. Yeah. You'd have to make sure, what you need to make sure is that the head teachers in the Brave New Rod world who have a great deal of autonomy, first of all, aren't so, I hesitate to use the word brainwashed, but aren't so already taken up with the idea that they'll be cowed and told what to do. So it might be the case that in this new world, you have to ensure that your head teachers are highly paid, really good individuals. The sort of super heads that they used to talk about in England, where people could come in and actually organise things. I think some of these people actually, and here's a little controversy, might not necessarily need to be teachers, but anyway. But certainly yes, autonomy for head teachers. And
then in this brave new world, how would these schools be run? Well, there would need to be some form of governance.
Yes.
So are you thinking an overall educational czar? Would you be up for the role?
I personally wouldn't be up for that role, Rod, but I can see you comfortably, Ed. I think you've got more energy than me, Rod, being so much younger. And I think actually what I would do, and you might not like this, but what I would do is I would actually strengthen the role of the inspectorate. I'd make sure that the inspectorate was full of good people, and I would have the inspectorate in charge of scrutiny.
Yeah.
But that would not be done by inspections. No. So you're being inspected and you've got to get the right marks on these, these particular criteria. It wouldn't be like that at all. It would be much more a matter of having inspectors who were attached to groups of schools in the way that actually, admittedly, they are in theory at the moment, but who have a great deal more power to talk to boards of governors. You'd have to have a board of governors in each school as well. But that board of governors wouldn't have any executive power. It would be there to assure, to ensure that the business of the school is kept running and so on and so forth.
Yeah, fully agree. And actually, one of my little kind of scribbled notes here was actually, I would probably double.
Actually, I'm going to say his little scribbled notes consist of a very nicely typed out sheet. So he's making it sound like, he does all this on the back of a matchbook, but, actually he's very, very well organised. That's why he could be the education czar and I couldn't.
Oh, he's giving all my secrets away. It's awful. Well, in my scribbled typewritten notes, I do suggest actually HMI, I'd be doubling its size, tripling its size, quadrupling its size. That's where the money should be going. In order for a more independent, autonomous education system to operate.
Yes, where you understood at the beginning of what we are now calling the Brave New World, that they all understood what their role was, and their role is to support head teachers in running schools at the beck and call of the head teacher, and also to scrutinise and to ensure that the standards of education are maintained within the schools, now that there is no longer local authority control in our world.
And of course, that would release a huge amount of financial resource were we to disband Education Scotland, local authorities.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. I think we have to accept that we also would like to see more money spent on education. One of the great things about, one of the most interesting things really, given that both of us led independent schools, is to consider what would happen if money was being spent on state school education in the same way as it's spent on independent school education. It's not all to do with money. Of course, a lot of it's to do with ethos, a lot of it's to do with discipline, a lot of it's to do with parenting, actually. Some of it is to do with parenting, indisputably. But we need to be spending more money per head on pupils as well, and that would also enable the financing of the kind of schools, very expensive little units, where children who have real behavioural difficulties are educated, and actually educated, in the long term, you'd save money on policing, less people would die of drug deaths, you'd save a lot of money on the health service, you'd save a lot of money on benefits because people who emerged from these kind of schools could actually work and stuff like that rather than not.
And you know, and people might scoff at that idea that somehow this would save money in the future, but you're absolutely right, because surely the core of humanity is in being properly educated. And if we believe in education, the power of education is not just a series of exam results at the end of 15 years of compulsory education. It has to be more than that. It has to be about being a responsible citizen. And I'm actually a bit of a critic of curriculum for excellence, but that's one area where I thought, we weren't just looking specifically at outcomes, educational assessment outcomes in terms of learning, but in terms of the whole human experience. And I think we need more focus on that.
I agree with that. I mean, obviously, Curriculum for Excellence has broadly failed, and it's broadly failed because it hasn't been put into practice properly, and also because what we require is a return to some kind of knowledge-based curriculum. There is nothing whatsoever at odds between the idea of a knowledge-based curriculum and the declared, what were they called? It wasn't outcomes. What's the word for,
the capacities.
The capacities, yes. The capacities of sorry, every time I think about the capacities of Curricular for Excellence, I think of that wee film, which was a dubbed bit of the film Downfall, about Hitler in his bunker and the generals coming in and Hitler banging on the table and saying, what is the fourth one? I always forget the fourth one, which is inevitably effective contributors, because nobody really knew what that meant anyway. But the bottom line is that the capacities of Curriculum for Excellence can, of course, be instilled in schools without them actually coming necessarily through the lessons that you are teaching in your classroom. This is why when independent schools are inspected through a Curriculum for Excellence model, they do so well. It's not because they have fallen into the way of teaching lessons in classrooms. It's because of everything else that goes on in independent schools, particularly extracurricular activities. And that's one of my 5 things, is about making sure that state schools provide lots of extracurricular activities, because it's extracurricular activities that build loyalty to the school, that very often make kids want to go to school in the first place. A 14-year-old boy will go to school and learn things in physics and English and maths and French in order to go to his football practice in the afternoon with his mates. And they're very, very good extracurricular activities, are very, very good socially. A long time ago now, actually 10 years ago now, when John Swinney was the Cabinet Secretary for Education as well as Deputy First Minister, he was kind enough to see me for half an hour to talk about, ideas for education. Now, knowing how these meetings work, which is that they're usually an enormous amount of flannel and a cup of tea, I went in with this one idea, which was that teachers in state schools should be paid for doing extracurricular activities. And it was really interesting because the civil servant at that meeting wrote everything down feverishly and nodded approvingly, and Mr. Swinney said, "Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, thanks very much indeed." And then inevitably, of course, his PA came in and said, "John, that's your next meeting." And of course, nothing was ever done about it. But I think that's an idea that would actually work, and I think it would revitalise a lot of schools, and I think it would, across the piece, also lead to better behaviour in the classroom, because kids don't like being suspended from their extracurricular activities. And that is one thing that independent schools do extremely well, and one reason why parents broadly who can afford independent education, which has of course gone up enormously, partly because of VAT being put on fees, which is another thing that we would get rid of. At the end of the day, that's one thing that independent schools do well, and state schools could do really well, and as well, and did until 1983.
Until 83 and the strike, and everything fell to bits. Prior to that, Scottish education was in a much better place, and I would probably argue, just as you are doing, that was primarily because of the extracurricular activities that were on offer for kids.
Yeah, and straightforward classroom discipline.
Yeah,
straightforward classroom discipline. Part of the problem with Scottish education, Scottish schools at the moment, and I think a lot of teachers would agree with this, is that people who were at school 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, i.e. parents and grandparents, can't really imagine what is happening in lots of schools in Scotland on a daily basis now.
Yeah.
They can't really believe it that young people swear at teachers, or
throw chairs out of windows.
or throw chairs out of windows, but or just sit and play with their phones.
Yeah. Or corridor window.
That just must seem astonishing. And in lots of ways, it is astonishing. It's as if it's all just been allowed to happen in a sort of enormous bubble of edu-speak and edu-theory, propagated actually largely by the universities, and without there being enough people from actual schools and actual classrooms to say that just won't work. What you actually require to do is you're required to get through 40 minutes of maths in a 40-minute lesson, or 38 minutes of maths in a 40-minute lesson. You don't require to be spending all your time concerned with one or two pupils and running after them because they run out the classroom and stuff.
And you shouldn't be. But this actually is a theme that I think pervades society as a whole. And I think what's happened, if we look at schools in particular, and we've discussed this in the past, the cruel nature of many teachers in schools in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where corporal punishment was entirely up to the individual concerned, and there was brutality.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So we had a system where there was a very powerful teaching community and a very weak pupil voice. And in some misguided way, and this is true of society as well in lots of different areas, we have tipped that balance too much the other way, where actually now pupil voice is all that counts, and teachers are very much in retreat, if you like. So that balance is way wrong, and what we need to try to do is find a system that recreates that properly balanced scale.
Oh, completely. I mean, the point is nobody I know is calling for the return of corporal punishment, for example. Your point about pupil voice is very interesting, but actually, I don't think that pupils have all that much of a voice. I think most pupils don't really have a voice at all. I think what happens in schools is that the balance is really between some pupils who are effectively often in charge of a classroom, teachers who may actually, particularly with older kids, be a bit afraid of children in their classrooms, and the rest of the kids who are torn between imitative behaviour of the bad kids because the bad kids get away with it, or wanting to learn because they understand that learning is good for them because it leads to a future, or wanting to learn because they are actually interested in history or interested in things. Now,
and they respect adults.
And they respect adults because they've been, dare I say, as a non-parent, brought up properly to respect adults.
Yeah.
And I mean, how you deal with that, I mean, you cannot legislate for parenting. I mean, you really can't, I don't think. But someone somewhere needs to start doing something about the idea that, again, you go back to the old days. If something happened to me at school, I wasn't actually all that worried about being disciplined at school, but I was very, very worried about that news getting home.
Yeah.
Now, that was bad. It was not good that I feared my mother so much. But on the other extreme, now, if people get into trouble at school, there's a default position by parents that they defend their child.
Regardless.
And it's just inevitable that you can see what the outcomes of that are going to be in later life for those children.
Oh yeah, and that's true of the independent sector as well. I mean, not just threatened with lawyers, but, threatened with a contract in my life once.
Oh,
I am not kidding.
It's good, actually. Yeah, because actually I passed a masked man with a shotgun at your door there, Rod. So
slightly unnerving, I have to say.
Well, quite.
Yeah.
I mean,
not quite sure how a political party's manifesto can sort that.
Yes. Teachers actually being hit by parents or attacked by parents, or
that's happened. Certainly in the 90s that happened to me, not so much attack, but certainly physically walked into a corner of my classroom. I had rather imposing a father who was very disappointed that I sought to interfere in what his daughter had been doing at the weekend and said it was absolutely none of my business. And in many respects, he was right, apart from the fact that she brought the problem from the weekend into the classroom. And I felt, I've got to deal with that somehow. But anyway, he took...
Just thinking what state this girl was in.
Well, yeah, we won't go into that. But yeah, he took umbrage at it. But anyway, yeah, you're right.
We'll go just to go back to the knowledge-based curriculum for a moment.
Actually, one of the points I'd written down, it would be nice to have a curriculum.
Yes, it would be nice to have a curriculum. It would be nice to have a curriculum that said what you were to teach, and that was kind of agreed by teachers, and agreed by, in relation to universities and colleges and employers, and in relation to what young people think and what the parents think as well. What is it that we want young people to know about?
Yeah.
But one of the things that we want young people to know about is stuff. You learn stuff. It's absolutely astonishing what young people don't know now.
Well, I mean, there's a perfect...
Culturally, don't know. They don't know things.
Look,
and part of that is definitely as a result of curriculum for excellence and the concept of outcomes.
Yeah, but it's not even just knowledge in terms of stuff. It's basic skills. How many times are you going into a shop and they can't work out the change?
Oh, yeah. Well,
and if something costs, £5.12 and you give them, something that makes that change easier for them,
yes.
they just look at you.
Yeah, they
have to do it on the till.
That is true. I mean, now is perhaps not the time and the place for discussion about skills that we absolutely require. I mean, it's that example of not being able to do basic arithmetic. I mean, I do find that shocking.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the till will tell them what the answer is. The fact that they can't do it.
Yeah. Well, I'm an old fart, and it disappoints me.
I can't disagree with that.
Which bit?
Just in terms of that idea that you in lots of respects you can't really have skills without knowledge.
No,
you can't really understand the world unless you can connect things up. Only connect, as Ian Forster so memorably says. Now, would you remove VAT on school fees?
Yes.
Yes, I would too. I don't know if I'd go any further than that. I think we will find, a voice in my ear is telling me that we will find that some political parties want to go further than that. This is actually maybe something we can talk about in our next one when we're looking at the actual manifestos of actual political parties. But I think removing VAT on school fees would be a reasonable step back to what is fair in terms of the contribution that fee-paying parents made to the education in the state sector by not imposing their children on the state sector. I think that.
Well, it's all purely from a financial sense. That does make sense. I mean, I know from my own experience that fewer pupils are joining us from the state sector. There's no question. There are fewer, which automatically means, of course, that the state sector, particularly at secondary school, will grow.
Yeah, I mean, the argument, the other side of that argument is, of course, that particularly in a city like Edinburgh, where such a proportion of young people are privately educated, possibly the highest in the world, I think. I mean, it's huge. It's extraordinary that 25% of kids in Edinburgh are educated privately. If those 25% of kids weren't being educated privately and the enormous power and influence of their parental group was brought to bear on state education, I do think state education would be pretty transformed in lots of ways. Whether or not the state sector could actually deal with that, I think is pretty questionable.
Well, certainly this short term it can possibly accommodate.
But one of the things I've always said about independent education, in which I am a firm believer, and I believe very much in the idea that parents should have a choice of lots of different kinds of schools to send their children to, whether they're paying for them or whether the state's paying for them. There should be lots of different kinds of opportunity for children educationally. But I do believe that if you are opposed to private education, then at the end of the day, what you should be saying is private education should be illegal, not let's dicker about with private education and try and squeeze some more money out of people, because the effect of that is, of course, on the poorest parents whose children are being educated privately, often on fee remission or sometimes full fee remission, as at my own old school.
And actually, in our brave new world, what we're actually suggesting is that every school in the country should be independent.
Well, I think that's an interesting way of putting it. I think as long as you have some overarching control in the form of the inspectorate,
Which we do as an independent school.
and also
In independent schools just now.
that the Scottish Government would, of course, be furnishing the monies for these schools. Local authorities would continue to furnish the monies for them. I don't think they're truly independent. But at some point we should talk about this, but maybe not today, but we should talk about the limits on school choice, because I think that's a really key thing that at the moment people don't really have most people do not have any choice really of where they're going to send their children to. What about teacher training? That's one of my 5. I'd reform teacher training.
Yeah, I'd reform that too. Well, I would get rid of it. Well, the theoretical side, I'd get them into classrooms.
Oh, completely.
5 days a week, full term, give them much more responsibility, much sooner, because that's where you learn.
I would also have people attached to, and some of these people, not, maybe a minority of them, would actually come from the closed down teacher training colleges, would be in schools assisting, watching, scrutinising the work of teachers in training, assisted by very highly experienced teachers, really good teachers as part of their job. Part of their paid job be to monitor the progress of teaching students as well as probationer school teachers. Yeah. So you'd continue to have a 2-year programme, but instead of it being 1 year in teacher training college and 1 year in a school as a probationer, these two things would be melded together to create a much richer kind of experience, because it's the practice of teaching. Of course. It's the actual practice and craft of teaching that is the most important thing that needs to be taught. I mean, I'm trying to think of the right technical word. I think it might be shite that is being taught in teacher training colleges at the moment is absolutely extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. At the same time, young people who are going to teacher training are being advised that the children's well-being is at the root of what they are there to do. Now, obviously, well-being's always been part of it. Every teacher, a pastoral teacher. At the end of the day, every teacher caring about young people. Yeah. But the weird thing is, and I just kind of had a vision about this at the weekend, really, is that at the same time as you're being told to look after the well-being of the kids, you're also being taught methodologies which distance yourself from the kids through the ongoing use of new IT technologies and so on and so forth. So it's as if you're a sort of clinician going in to present something to a group of young people who, let's remember, contain 43% children with additional support needs. Yeah. I mean, all of it is a kind of perfect storm of mess.
It's madness. It's all madness.
Yeah.
I quite like the idea of coaching rather than teaching. It's not just about having the opportunity of being in front of a class and learning that skill, but I would have a huge amount of student time spent in front of teachers who are at the top of their game.
Yes, completely.
Because it's sometimes the greatest lessons that I ever learned as a teacher were not necessarily what I was doing myself, but it was viewing what colleagues were doing in classrooms. And added to that, the one thing that I really did want to say was, for me, the most important aspect of that teacher-pupil relationship is that it's a relationship.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That you actually are, and this is about your point about caring. This is not an add-on. This is not an extra. That is a feature of being a teacher.
Yeah, completely. I mean, when I started teaching in 1980 at Daniel Stewart's Melville College.
1980.
Yes, 1980. I was young. I was 12, and I was beginning to teach. In Daniel Stewart's Melville College in 1980. No, actually, I was 23, and at the end of the day, I was a kind of, let's be absolutely honest, Rod, I was a very, very skinny, long-haired homosexual, is what I was, in being thrust into this boys' school. And there was no way that I was going to be able to use traditional disciplinary methods to quell them. And actually, it was hard. It was hard at first. It was hard at first, until eventually I established good relationships with classes and with individuals. And at that point, things began to take off, and it was easier for me to work. And year on year, it got easier and easier and easier to do, because you built up your reputation and so on and so forth. Now, of course, what people are going to say listening to that is that was a private school, and of course you weren't dealing with children who had additional support needs. But I was dealing with children who had additional support needs. It just wasn't recognised in that way at that time. And yes, it was a private school, but it was an all-boys school, and it was not easy to teach there. It was not a piece of cake by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, when I look at
so you have to learn how to do these things.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is something that you can't learn if you're sitting in the education department of a university listening to somebody talking about Russian education of the 1930s or listening to somebody talking about educational psychology. It's not something you can learn.
No, I agree with that. And when I look back at my own experience, you know, I did work in local authority schools, first as a supply teacher and then on a permanent contract in West Lothian. And some of my happiest days were in local authority schools, and some of my worst days have been in independent schools. So actually, kids are kids, you know, and yet some are privileged, and some have certainly in the independent sector tend to have quite educated parents, and they come from a book background, a literary background, and you know, the behaviours can still be difficult, but they are sometimes quite different. But the key for me was always standing in front of a class. Was one, establishing that kind of discipline first. And it's true, actually, even in the children's home. I'll tell you a very brief story. I went up having to deal with something where the police had been called, which is not an unusual occurrence. And 4 kids in the home. And they're great kids, and it's about what we're discussing about relationship between teacher and pupils in the same way. They want to build a relationship that's based on trust. They have to trust who you are.
Yeah.
Are you somebody that will lose your temper? Are you somebody that they are naturally inclined to be frightened of? Are you a person that is actually far too soft and they know they can take advantage of you? But the important thing is that element of trust, I think. And I've discovered that with children in care, that process of forming that relationship and that bond takes very much longer because of what they've gone through and the fact that adults have continually let them down throughout their lives. That's been fascinating for me. So, you know, be 60 plus and I'm still very much learning about those key indicators within relationships that are actually crucial. Because, you know, now, there's one child there, I can't go into any detail, but who's been there for 2 years. And the relationship that I have with that child bears no resemblance to those early days when that child first arrived. Much more powerful, much more trusting, a huge level now of mutual respect, and that young person can see a future. But that has occurred because that ability to trust took a long time, but is now embedded. And that actually in education, as well as in social care, the relationship between adult and child is absolutely crucial. It's central to everything a teacher does.
I think that's a good point at which to wind this up, actually. So we're talking about, that was the last point we were making there, was about reform of teacher training.
Yeah.
We're also interested in looking at, in political parties thinking about the presumption of mainstreaming. Absolutely. It's a failed policy, and it's a policy that needs to be radically revised. We're very keen on the idea of schools having a much greater degree of autonomy.
Yep.
We want to see Education Scotland abolished.
Yep.
Mobile phones banned?
No.
All right, okay, we'll pick up on that. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, mobile phone use in schools needs to stop, probably. And yeah, I think so. I think that probably that needs to happen. I'm not necessarily saying I wouldn't let kids have a mobile phone in their pocket in schools. There are lots of schools in which children are still...
It's become, that whole issue is about what schools allow and do not allow.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the calculator is a tool. I mean, I remember first getting a calculator in I don't know, it was the late 70s.
1932.
Yeah, it was mid-70s. I mean, I was, 12, 13, and I absolutely blown away. But the idea, of course, you couldn't take the calculator into school in those days.
No,
if you shouldn't.
No, you had to be able
you had to do it yourself.
Yes, exactly.
You see, exactly. So, it's for me, the mobile phone can be a very valuable tool, but it's how it's used. It's how it's structured within a school day. But I wouldn't ban them personally. But anyway, we'll discuss that another time.
Well, and we're conscious, of course, that every MSP, I think almost every MSP now listens to this podcast. And therefore, what we'll be doing is contacting some MSPs and talking to them in the next couple of weeks. And hopefully you'll be hearing from them on our next podcast prior to the election.
And we'll then obviously listen to what they have to say, and we'll have our own take.
We will.
Each of those.
We are also interested in what you listeners, particularly teachers, but parents and young people as well, have to say to us about education and what political parties should be thinking about in the run-up to this crucial election at Holyrood. So please, please, please contact us and leave emails on. Here's Rod's going to tell you what the email address is.
It's rodandcameron@gmail.com.
Of course it is. Very good.
Had you forgotten that?
No, but your memory's not as bad as it was. I see.
Okay.
rodandcameron@gmail.com. I'm just saying it again because repeating things is a good way of learning them.
Indeed.
And send us your views, please, on what political parties should be thinking about in the forthcoming election.
And also really helpful to us, if you're enjoying the podcast and the show in general, leave me a quick review. Really helps new listeners find us. Don't leave bad reviews, clearly. We're not interested in bad reviews.
And it hurts us. Rod cried. We got a bad review once and he cried.
Yeah.
Also, please pass it on to other people. This is really the key thing. I'm pleased occasionally to bump into people who say, "Oh, I've been listening to your podcast."
Yep.
My response to that is always, please tell 10 other people about it then.
Absolutely. Well, Cameron, that's it for this episode of Two Heads Are Better Than One. And as Cameron was saying, we hope you've enjoyed our journey through the world of schools and leadership, and especially today's discussion in what should be in the manifesto of the political parties as we approach the Scottish elections in May. However, remember, in education and life, two heads really are better than one. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Class dismissed.